February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands. Corporal Tony Stein of the 28th Marines crouched behind a low ridge of volcanic sand, barely 200 yards from where his landing craft had deposited him minutes earlier. Around him, Marines were pinned down by machine gun fire that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Stein scanned the terrain ahead: barren black volcanic sand, scattered rocks, a few shell craters. No visible enemy positions. Yet the fire was continuous, accurate, deadly. Then he saw it, a small concrete bunker, almost invisible against the dark sand, with a firing slit barely 6 inches high. As he watched, the barrel of a machine gun withdrew into the slit and disappeared. Seconds later, fire erupted from a completely different position 50 yards away. It was the same gun, or at least it seemed to be. The Japanese were firing, then moving through tunnels to new positions before Marines could respond. What Stein and thousands of other Marines landing on Iwo Jima that morning couldn't see was that beneath the volcanic ash and rock lay one of the most sophisticated defensive tunnel systems ever constructed. Over 11 miles of tunnels connected hundreds of fortified positions, artillery bunkers, command posts, hospitals, and ammunition storage rooms. Japanese defenders could move invisibly between positions, concentrate forces where needed, and disappear before American firepower could engage them. The battle for Iwo Jima would last 36 days and cost nearly 7,000 American lives, one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps' history. The story of the secret tunnels beneath Iwo Jima is the story of how engineering and determination transformed a small volcanic island into a fortress that extracted maximum cost for every yard of ground, and how the battle fundamentally changed American understanding of what it would cost to invade Japan itself. Iwo Jima is a volcanic island roughly 8 square miles in area, located 760 miles south of Tokyo. The island is dominated by Mount Suribachi, a 550-foot extinct volcano at the southern tip. The rest of the island rises in a series of terraces toward the Motoyama Plateau in the north. The terrain is barren volcanic ash and rock, with virtually no vegetation and no fresh water. From an American strategic perspective, Iwo Jima was valuable for 3 reasons. First, it hosted Japanese radar stations and fighter bases that provided early warning of B-29 raids against Japan, and intercepted bombers on their way to and from targets. Eliminating these defenses would improve bomber survivability. Second, once captured, Iwo Jima could provide emergency landing fields for damaged B-29s that couldn't make it back to the Marianas. Third, Iwo Jima could base P-51 Mustang fighters that could escort B-29s all the way to Japan and back. From the Japanese perspective, Iwo Jima was part of the inner defensive ring protecting the home islands. Its loss would bring American air power closer to Japan and provide a base for intensified bombing. More importantly, the battle for Iwo Jima would demonstrate to Americans the cost of invading Japan itself. If Americans could be made to suffer catastrophic casualties taking a small island, perhaps they would negotiate peace rather than attempt invasion of the home islands. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944 to command the defense. Kuribayashi was an unusual Japanese officer. He had spent time in the United States as a military attaché, spoke some English, and understood American industrial capacity. He recognized that Japan was losing the war and that Iwo Jima couldn't be held indefinitely. His mission wasn't to win. It was to exact maximum cost and delay American advance as long as possible. Kuribayashi studied previous island battles and drew conclusions that would shape his defensive strategy. Japanese forces at Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu had suffered catastrophic casualties from American naval bombardment and airstrikes before ground assault even began. Traditional above-ground fortifications, no matter how strong, couldn't withstand the weight of naval gunfire America could bring to bear. The solution was to go underground, building defenses that bombardment couldn't destroy. The strategy represented radical departure from Japanese military doctrine. Traditional doctrine emphasized aggressive defense and counterattacks to drive invaders into the sea. Kuribayashi forbade banzai charges and beach defense. Instead, defenders would allow Americans to land unopposed, then engage them from fortified positions inland where naval gunfire would be less effective and where terrain would slow American advance. The plan was controversial. Many Japanese officers considered it cowardly to allow the enemy to land without opposition. The tradition of dying gloriously in battle was deeply embedded in military culture. Kuribayashi had to enforce his orders ruthlessly, court-martialing officers who objected. He knew that traditional tactics would result in quick defeat. His way offered the only chance to prolong the battle and inflict maximum casualties. The garrison eventually numbered approximately 21,000 troops, a mix of Imperial Japanese Army and Navy personnel. These weren't garrison troops or rear echelon personnel. They were infantry, artillery, engineers, and specialists selected for the mission. Many were veterans of campaigns in China or the Pacific. The force was adequately equipped with weapons, ammunition, and supplies to conduct sustained defense. The tunnel system beneath Iwo Jima was the most sophisticated defensive fortification the United States faced during the Pacific War. The construction took months and consumed enormous labor, but the result was a fortress that existed almost entirely underground. The geology of Iwo Jima made tunnel construction possible. The island's volcanic rock was soft enough to excavate, but stable enough that tunnels didn't require extensive shoring. The rock could be cut with hand tools, though the work was slow and difficult. The volcanic nature of the island also meant there were natural caves and fissures that could be incorporated into the tunnel system. Construction began in mid-1944 and continued until the American landing. Japanese forces worked around the clock, excavating tunnels and fortified positions. The work was brutal. Temperatures underground exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and sulfur fumes from volcanic vents made breathing difficult. Workers labored in shifts, advancing tunnels foot by foot through solid rock. The tunnel network eventually exceeded 11 miles in length, though some estimates suggest as much as 18 miles. The exact length is unknown because not all tunnels were discovered during or after the battle. The system had multiple levels. Some tunnels were as deep as 75 feet below the surface, providing protection against even the heaviest naval shells and aerial bombs. The system was designed with military efficiency. Main tunnels were typically 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, large enough for men to move through while crouching, but not large enough for wasted space. Smaller connecting tunnels branched off to fighting positions, ammunition storage, or specialized facilities. The layout maximized protection while minimizing excavation effort. Fighting positions were connected to the tunnel system through short access tunnels. A typical position might have 2 or 3 access points, allowing defenders to enter and exit from multiple directions. This meant that even if Americans captured one entrance, defenders could escape through others. It also allowed reinforcements to reach positions without exposing themselves to American fire. Artillery bunkers were particularly sophisticated. Large guns were positioned in caves with narrow firing ports overlooking the landing beaches and terrain beyond. The guns could fire a few rounds, then be withdrawn deeper into the caves before American counter-battery fire arrived. Some positions had multiple firing ports at different angles, allowing a single gun to engage targets from apparently different locations. Command posts were located deep underground where they were essentially invulnerable to bombardment. Kuribayashi's command post under Mount Suribachi was 75 feet beneath the surface, connected by tunnels to observation posts and fighting positions. The command post had communications equipment, maps, and facilities for the command staff. Similar command posts throughout the island allowed coordination of the defense, even as surface positions were destroyed. Medical facilities underground allowed treatment of wounded without exposing them to American fire. The hospitals were crewed by any standard, basically enlarged tunnel sections with medical supplies, but they were safer than any above-ground facility would have been. Wounded who could be saved were treated and returned to duty. Those who couldn't be saved were given what comfort was possible. Ammunition storage was distributed throughout the tunnel system. Rather than concentrating ammunition in large magazines vulnerable to catastrophic explosion, supplies were stored in multiple small caches. This meant that even if Americans destroyed one storage area, others would remain functional. The distribution complicated logistics, but improved survivability. Water storage was critical because Iwo Jima had no natural fresh water. The Japanese stored water in tanks throughout the tunnel system, collecting rainwater and bringing additional water by submarine. The water supply was adequate but not generous. Rationing was necessary, particularly as the battle dragged on and resupply became impossible. Ventilation was perhaps the most difficult engineering challenge. Natural ventilation through tunnel entrances was inadequate, particularly in deeper sections. The Japanese used a combination of natural ventilation shafts and forced ventilation in some areas. The ventilation was never adequate, and sulfur fumes were a constant problem. Many defenders suffered respiratory problems from prolonged exposure to the fumes. The entrances and exits were designed to be inconspicuous. Many were hidden behind rocks or in depressions that made them difficult to spot. Some entrances were camouflaged with netting and rocks. The goal was to prevent Americans from identifying tunnel entrances and sealing them with explosives or using them to attack into the tunnel system. Defensive obstacles were integrated with the tunnel system. Minefields channeled attackers into kill zones. Wire obstacles slowed advances. Tank traps prevented armor from supporting infantry. All these obstacles were covered by fire from positions connected to the tunnels, allowing defenders to engage Americans forced into the open while remaining protected themselves. The sophistication of the system impressed even American military engineers who studied it after the battle. The Japanese had created a three-dimensional defensive system, where the actual fighting positions were just the visible tip of a much larger underground fortress. Every position was supported by the tunnel system, making it far more difficult to reduce than surface fortifications would have been. American intelligence knew Iwo Jima was heavily fortified but significantly underestimated the extent and sophistication of the defenses. Aerial reconnaissance revealed some fortifications, and submarines observing the island reported extensive construction activity. But the underground nature of the defenses meant that most of the fortress was invisible to reconnaissance. The American plan called for a massive preliminary bombardment to destroy Japanese defenses before the landing. Naval gunfire and aerial bombing would pummel the island for 3 days immediately before the assault. The bombardment was expected to suppress or destroy most defensive positions, allowing Marines to land and advance rapidly across the island. The Marine commanders requested a longer bombardment, 10 days rather than 3, arguing that the visible fortifications were stronger than normal and would require more time to reduce. The Navy disagreed, stating that 3 days of intense bombardment would be adequate, and that extending the bombardment would consume ammunition needed for other operations. The compromise was 3 days of bombardment plus several weeks of prior airstrikes. The assault plan called for the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions to land abreast on the southeastern beaches. The 3rd Marine Division would remain in reserve, landing if needed. The landing beaches were designated from south to north: Green Beach, Red Beaches 1 and 2, Yellow Beaches 1 and 2, and Blue Beaches 1 and 2. The initial objective was to secure a beachhead, then advance across the narrow southern portion of the island to isolate Mount Suribachi. Once Suribachi was isolated, one regiment would reduce it while the rest of the landing force advanced north across the island. The northern advance was expected to be the main effort. The Motoyama Plateau contained the airfields that were the strategic objective. Planners estimated the island could be secured in 4 to 5 days of heavy fighting. The estimates were based on experience at previous islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu. Those battles had been costly, but relatively short. The most intense fighting typically lasted less than a week before organized resistance collapsed. Iwo Jima was smaller than Saipan or Peleliu, suggesting that the battle might actually be shorter despite the obvious heavy fortifications. What the planners didn't fully appreciate was how fundamentally different Kuribayashi's defensive strategy was from previous Japanese defenses. The tunnel system meant that bombardment would be far less effective than usual. The dispersed defensive positions meant that reducing them would require slow, methodical infantry assault against each position individually. The interconnected nature of the defenses meant that even after a position was captured, Japanese forces could reoccupy it through the tunnels. The preliminary bombardment began on February 16, 1945. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers pounded visible fortifications with thousands of shells. Carrier aircraft struck targets across the island. The bombardment was intense, creating a nearly continuous roar of explosions and throwing up enormous clouds of volcanic ash and smoke. The Japanese response was minimal. Rather than revealing their positions by returning fire, Kuribayashi ordered his forces to remain hidden. A few positions fired to maintain the appearance of active defense, but most remained silent. This worried some American commanders. The lack of return fire might indicate an elaborate trap. But intelligence assessments concluded that the bombardment was suppressing the defenses effectively. On the morning of February 19th, the assault began. At 0830 hours, The first wave of Marines approached the beaches in LVTs and LCVPs. The naval gunfire shifted inland, and the beaches fell silent. The landing was unopposed. Marines reached the beaches and began advancing inland without taking fire. This was unprecedented in the Pacific War. At every previous island, beaches had been swept by defensive fire. The Marines quickly discovered why the landing was unopposed. The volcanic ash beach was almost impossible to cross. The soft ash provided no traction for vehicles or traction for men climbing the steep beach terraces. Vehicles bogged down. Men struggled up steep slopes, often sliding back down. The landing force began bunching up on the beaches as following waves arrived faster than leading waves could advance inland. Then, at approximately 0900 hours, the Japanese opened fire. Artillery and mortar shells began falling on the crowded beaches. Machine guns engaged Marines struggling to advance inland. The fire came from positions that the bombardment had apparently not touched. Within minutes, the beaches became killing zones. The Marines continued advancing because there was no alternative. Staying on the beaches meant certain death. The only option was to move forward into the fire and try to silence the positions engaging them. Small unit leaders led their men off the beaches toward the first objectives, accepting casualties as the cost of getting clear of the beach. The advance was measured in yards. Every depression in the ground became a defensive position. Every cluster of rocks concealed a Japanese fighting position. The Marines would identify a position, assault it with grenades and small arms fire, then discover another position 20 or 30 yards beyond it. The process repeated endlessly. By nightfall on D-Day, the Marines had secured a beachhead approximately 4,500 yards wide and 700 yards deep at its deepest point. The cost had been approximately 2,400 casualties, including over 500 dead. These were the highest D-Day casualties in Marine Corps' history. The optimistic 4 to 5 day estimate for securing the island suddenly seemed wildly unrealistic. The pattern established on D-Day continued for weeks. Every advance was contested from fortified positions that had to be reduced individually. The Marines developed procedures for attacking the positions, but the tactics were slow, dangerous, and costly. A typical assault on a Japanese position would begin with reconnaissance to identify the position's location and likely fields of fire. This reconnaissance was dangerous. Marines had to expose themselves enough to draw fire that would reveal enemy positions. Men died learning where the Japanese were. Once a position was identified, supporting arms would engage it. Tanks would fire directly into the position. Artillery would be called to bombard it. Naval gunfire might engage if the position was within range. Flamethrower tanks were particularly valuable. They could approach positions and spray burning fuel into the firing slits. While supporting fires suppressed the position, infantry would maneuver to approach it. The approach was covered by fire from other Marines who would shoot at any Japanese who exposed themselves. The assault team would reach the position and use explosives, flamethrowers, or grenades to clear it. But clearing a position didn't necessarily end the threat. The Japanese could escape through tunnels, then return when the Marines moved on. Some positions had to be cleared multiple times. Marines learned to seal tunnel entrances with explosives or by bulldozing earth over them. But the tunnel system was so extensive that sealing every entrance was nearly impossible. The flamethrower became the weapon of choice against fortified positions. The flamethrower could reach into caves and tunnels where grenades and small arms fire were ineffective. The psychological effect on Japanese defenders was substantial. Being burned alive was one of the most feared ways to die. But using flamethrowers was extremely dangerous for the operators, who became priority targets. The demolitions teams were constantly in demand. Engineers and infantry demolition specialists would approach positions with satchel charges, bags of explosives that could be thrown into bunkers or placed against obstacles. The work required approaching within feet of enemy positions, often under fire. Demolition specialists suffered high casualty rates but were essential to reducing fortifications. Tanks provided critical support but were vulnerable. The Japanese had anti-tank guns positioned to cover likely tank approaches. They also used magnetic mines that tank hunting teams would attach to vehicles. The Marines learned to use tanks in close cooperation with infantry. The infantry protected tanks from close-in threats while tanks provided direct fire support against fortifications. Artillery support was continuous. Marine artillery battalions fired thousands of shells daily, called in by forward observers with rifle companies. The artillery could engage positions that direct fire weapons couldn't reach. It could also deliver suppressive fire that kept Japanese defenders inside their fortifications while Marines maneuvered. Naval gunfire remained available throughout the battle. Destroyers and cruisers offshore could engage targets designated by shore fire control parties. The naval guns provided fires heavier than Marine artillery could deliver. But naval gunfire was less precise than artillery and couldn't be used as close to friendly forces. Air support was available when weather permitted. Carrier aircraft could strike targets beyond the front lines or provide close support for assaults on particularly strong positions. The coordination between ground forces and aircraft improved throughout the battle as procedures were refined and communications were improved. Medical evacuation was continuous. Corpsmen with rifle companies provided immediate first aid. Wounded were evacuated to battalion aid stations, then to regimental and division medical facilities on the beach, and finally to hospital ships offshore. The medical chain functioned well despite constant enemy fire. Corpsmen became among the most decorated and most casualties-prone personnel in the Marine forces. Mount Suribachi dominated the southern portion of Iwo Jima. The 550-foot extinct volcano provided observation over the entire landing area and much of the island beyond. Japanese observers on Suribachi directed artillery fire against Marines on the beaches and advancing inland. Neutralizing Suribachi was essential to securing the southern portion of the island. The 28th Marines were assigned to isolate and capture Suribachi. Their advance across the narrow southern portion of Iwo Jima separated Suribachi from the rest of the Japanese defensive positions. By D+3, Suribachi was isolated and the 28th Marines could focus on reducing it. The mountain was honeycombed with tunnels and fortified positions. Over 1,000 Japanese defenders occupied positions throughout the mountain and in the tunnel system beneath it. They had stockpiled ammunition and supplies for sustained defense. Kuribayashi had ordered them to hold as long as possible, trading their lives for time. The Marines began working their way up the mountain, reducing positions one by one. The terrain favored the defenders' steep slopes channeled attackers into kill zones, and boulders and rocks provided cover for defensive positions. The Marines used the same tactics that worked elsewhere on the island: identify positions, engage them with supporting fires, assault with infantry and demolitions. By February 23, D+4, Marine patrols reached the summit without encountering resistance. It appeared that the Japanese had either withdrawn or been killed. A 40-man patrol from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, was sent to the summit to raise an American flag. At 10:20 hours, they raised a small flag on a length of pipe. The moment was photographed and filmed. Later that morning, a larger flag was brought up to replace the smaller one. Joe Rosenthal, an Associated Press photographer, captured the moment when 6 Marines raised the second flag. The photograph would become the most iconic image of World War II and one of the most famous photographs in history. But the battle for Suribachi wasn't over. Japanese defenders remained in the tunnel system beneath the mountain. They continued fighting, emerging from tunnels to attack Marines on the surface, then disappearing underground again. The Marines spent additional days clearing the mountain, sealing tunnel entrances, and eliminating holdouts. The fighting continued even after the flag raising, though at reduced intensity. The capture of Suribachi was celebrated as a major victory, and indeed it was significant. But it represented only 1/3 of the island. The northern portion, containing the airfields and most of the Japanese defensive strength, remained to be captured. And the fighting there would be even more brutal than the battle for Suribachi. The northern portion of Iwo Jima became known as the meat grinder, for the continuous, grinding combat that slowly advanced Marine lines through prepared defensive positions. The terrain was more open than around Suribachi, but was still dominated by ridges, ravines, and rocky outcrops that provided defensive positions. 3 areas became particularly infamous: Hill 382, the amphitheater, and Turkey Knob. These positions, mutually supporting and connected by the tunnel system, formed a defensive complex that resisted Marine assault for over a week. Hill 382 was the highest point in the area, providing observation over surrounding terrain. The amphitheater was a depression surrounded by high ground, creating a natural fortress. Turkey Knob was a rocky ridge honeycombed with caves. The Marines attacked these positions repeatedly, gaining ground in yards. Each advance was contested. Each yard cost casualties. The Japanese defenders, well supplied from the tunnel system and reinforced through the tunnels, fought from positions that had been prepared for months, specifically to maximize American casualties. The 4th Marine Division bore the brunt of fighting in this area. They advanced day after day, attacking positions that seemed impossible to reduce. Artillery, tanks, aircraft, naval gunfire all were employed continuously. Yet the Japanese held, emerging from tunnels to replace casualties, manning positions that should have been untenable. The 3rd Marine Division, initially held in reserve, was committed on D+4 to reinforce the attack. Their assignment was to advance up the center of the island toward Airfield No. 2 and then to the northern coast. They encountered the same pattern of fortified positions and tunnel-supported defense. Their casualties mounted at rates comparable to the other 2 divisions. The fighting became attritional warfare reminiscent of World War I. Positions were attacked, captured at great cost, then found to be reoccupied by Japanese who emerged from tunnels after the Marines moved on. Marines learned to leave guards on captured positions to prevent reoccupation, but this consumed manpower and reduced the strength available for continued advance. The Japanese use of the tunnel system reached peak effectiveness in this phase. Defenders could concentrate at threatened points, then disperse to other positions through the tunnels. They could evacuate wounded and bring forward ammunition without exposing themselves. They could observe American movements through carefully positioned observation ports and direct fire accordingly. The Marines began deliberately targeting tunnel entrances. Combat engineers used explosives to collapse tunnels or seal entrances. Bulldozers buried entrances under tons of earth. Chemical smoke was pumped into tunnels, hoping to force defenders out or kill them with the fumes. These methods had limited success. The tunnel system was too extensive and had too many interconnections. By early March, the Marines had been fighting continuously for 2 weeks. Casualties exceeded 13,000, far beyond initial estimates. Units were combat ineffective due to casualties rifle companies that should have had 200 men operated, with 50 or 60. Replacements arriving from rear areas went immediately into frontline combat with minimal orientation. The physical exhaustion was as debilitating as casualties. Marines had been fighting with minimal rest, inadequate food, and constant stress since the landing. Sleep deprivation affected judgment and reaction times. The volcanic ash got into everything: eyes, noses, weapons, food. The sulfur smell was constant. Water was rationed. Everyone was filthy, exhausted, and operating on adrenaline and determination. Yet the advance continued. The Marines were taking ground, destroying Japanese positions, and reducing the defensive perimeter. The progress was slow, but it was progress. By mid-March, the 3 Marine divisions had fought their way to the northern coast, splitting Japanese forces into isolated pockets. Organized resistance was collapsing, though fighting would continue. By March 16, D+26, the island was declared secured. But secured didn't mean the fighting was over. Japanese holdouts remained in the tunnel system, emerging at night to attack Marine positions. The Marines spent additional days hunting down holdouts, sealing tunnel entrances, and clearing caves. The final organized Japanese resistance came on March 26, D+36, when approximately 300 Japanese conducted one of the few counterattacks of the battle. They infiltrated Marine lines at night and attacked rear area positions, causing chaos before being killed or driven back. The attack demonstrated that organized Japanese forces still existed in the tunnel system a week after the island was declared secured. General Suribachi was killed sometime in late March. The exact date and circumstances are unknown. He was last heard from on March 23 in a final message to Tokyo. He likely died leading the March 26 counterattack or in its immediate aftermath. His body was never identified. The commander who had designed the defense and led it with determination disappeared into the chaos of the battle's final days. The battle officially ended on March 26, 1945, after 36 days of combat. The American casualties were staggering: 6,821 killed and 19,217 wounded. Over 26,000 total casualties out of approximately 70,000 Marines committed to the battle. 1/3 of the assault force became casualties. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, the most for any single battle in American history. The Japanese casualties were equally appalling. Of approximately 21,000 defenders, only 216 were captured. The rest died in the tunnels, caves, and fortified positions they had spent months preparing. The casualty ratio 1.2 American casualties for each Japanese casualty was the worst the Marines experienced in the Pacific War. At previous islands, Japanese casualties significantly outnumbered American casualties. At Iwo Jima, the ratio approached parity. The capture of Iwo Jima provided the benefits that strategic planners had anticipated. B-29s used the island as an emergency landing field by war's end. Over 2,400 B-29s had made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, probably saving over 20,000 aircrew lives. P-51 Mustangs based on Iwo Jima began escorting B-29s to Japan in April 1945, providing fighter protection that reduced bomber losses significantly. But the cost raised disturbing questions. If capturing an 8-square-mile island cost 26,000 casualties, what would invading Japan itself cost? Planners preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan used Iwo Jima casualty rates to project potential losses. The estimates were sobering. Hundreds of thousands of American casualties, perhaps millions of Japanese military and civilian casualties. These casualty projections influenced the decision to use atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The argument that atomic weapons saved lives by making invasion unnecessary was based partly on casualty rates from Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Whether the atomic bombings were justified remains debated, but the experience of Iwo Jima definitely influenced decision-makers considering alternatives to invasion. The tunnel system proved to be the most effective Japanese defensive innovation of the Pacific War. The concept of defense in depth using underground fortifications had defeated American advantages in firepower and mobility. The Marines had won through determination and willingness to accept casualties, not through tactical or technological superiority. The lessons were sobering for military planners contemplating future operations against prepared defenses. The Marines studied the battle extensively, analyzing what worked and what didn't. The use of flamethrowers and demolitions against fortified positions was validated. The importance of close tank infantry cooperation was confirmed. The value of continuous close air support was demonstrated. But no amount of tactical refinement could eliminate the fundamental reality. Reducing prepared underground fortifications required slow, costly infantry assault. The tunnel system itself became object of study after the battle. Military engineers mapped what they could find of the system, though many tunnels remained undiscovered. The sophistication of the Japanese engineering impressed even critics. The construction had been done with hand tools and minimal machinery, yet the result had been militarily effective fortifications that withstood everything American firepower could deliver. Survivors of the battle carried its memories for the rest of their lives. The intensity of the combat, the continuous casualties, the seeming endlessness of the battle all created psychological impacts that affected veterans decades later. Many Iwo Jima veterans suffered what would now be diagnosed as PTSD. The support for combat veterans was minimal by modern standards, and many struggled with their experiences in isolation. The flag raising on Suribachi, captured in Rosenthal's photograph, became symbol of American determination and sacrifice. The image was used in war bond drives, appeared on a postage stamp, and eventually inspired the Marine Corps' War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia. The photograph transcended its origins, becoming an icon that represented not just Iwo Jima but American military service generally. Understanding the Japanese perspective on Iwo Jima requires recognizing both the strategic situation and the cultural context. By early 1945, Japanese military leaders understood the war was lost. The question wasn't whether Japan would be defeated, but how and at what cost. Iwo Jima was conceived as delaying action that would demonstrate the cost of advancing toward Japan's home islands. General Kuribayashi's strategy reflected his understanding of American military strengths and Japanese weaknesses. He couldn't match American firepower or logistics. He couldn't prevent American landings. What he could do was force Americans to fight for every yard of ground, maximizing casualties and buying time. The tunnel system was the practical expression of this strategy. The construction of the tunnels was itself a remarkable feat of determination. The work was brutal, excavating volcanic rock in heat exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, breathing sulfur fumes, knowing that the fortifications being built would likely become tombs. Yet the garrison persisted, working until the American landing because they believed their sacrifice served larger purposes. The discipline Kuribayashi imposed on his forces was extraordinary. Forbidding banzai charges went against deep cultural traditions that emphasized glorious death in battle. His insistence on fighting from prepared positions and trading space for time required his troops to suppress instincts for aggressive action. That he maintained this discipline throughout the battle, preventing the wasteful counterattacks that had characterized Japanese defense at other islands, demonstrated remarkable leadership. The civilians who had lived on Iwo Jima before the war were evacuated before the battle. This spared them the fate of civilians on Saipan and Okinawa, where thousands died in combat or chose suicide rather than surrender. The decision to evacuate civilians recognized that Iwo Jima would be total war zone where civilian presence would be impossible. The Japanese garrison understood they wouldn't be relieved or evacuated. Japanese naval power had been broken at Leyte Gulf. The American fleet controlled the waters around Iwo Jima. No rescue was possible. The garrison fought knowing they would die on the island. This acceptance of inevitable death influenced tactics. There was no need to preserve forces for withdrawal because no withdrawal was possible. The final messages from Iwo Jima to Tokyo reflected pride in having accomplished the mission. The garrison had held far longer than anyone expected. They had inflicted casualties at rates unprecedented in the Pacific War. They had demonstrated what prepared defenses and determined troops could accomplish even against overwhelming American power. Whether this achievement justified the human cost remains questioned without easy answer. The tunnels beneath Iwo Jima remain largely intact. The island was returned to Japanese control in 1968. It's now administered as part of Tokyo Prefecture, though access is restricted to annual memorial visits. The tunnels are mostly sealed or have collapsed, but they remain as monument to the battle and the men who fought there. The tactical lessons from Iwo Jima influenced military thinking about fortifications and defensive warfare. The effectiveness of underground positions against modern firepower was proven. Military planners contemplating invasions of prepared defenses had to account for the possibility that enemies would adopt similar strategies. The doctrine and equipment for reducing fortified positions was refined based on Iwo Jima experience. The strategic lesson was arguably more important. Territorial conquest against determined defenders in prepared positions requires accepting casualties that may exceed the strategic value of the objective. This lesson influenced American military thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond. The reluctance to commit ground forces to operations where heavy casualties are likely traces partly to experiences like Iwo Jima. The Marine Corps incorporates Iwo Jima into its institutional memory and culture. The battle represents sacrifice, determination, and accomplishment of mission despite overwhelming difficulty. Every Marine learns about Iwo Jima during training. The lessons about small unit leadership, courage under fire, and perseverance are part of Marine identity. The annual reunions of Iwo Jima veterans brought together Americans and Japanese who had fought each other. These reunions acknowledged shared humanity despite the brutal combat. Veterans on both sides recognized that they had been young men following orders, fighting for their countries, doing their duties as they understood them. The reconciliation didn't erase the memories but provided context for processing them. The debate about whether Iwo Jima was necessary continues among historians. Some argue the strategic benefits emergency landing fields for B-29s and bases for P-51s justified the cost. Others contend the benefits could have been achieved through other means at lower cost. The question is ultimately unanswerable because we can't know what would have happened if Iwo Jima hadn't been invaded. What's undeniable is that the men who fought at Iwo Jima, American and Japanese, experienced combat of extraordinary intensity and duration. They fought in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. They accomplished missions that seemed impossible. They paid prices that should never be forgotten. The secret tunnels beneath Iwo Jima transformed a small volcanic island into a fortress that extracted maximum cost for every yard of ground. The 11+ miles of tunnels, connecting hundreds of fortified positions in three-dimensional defensive network, represented Japanese military engineering and determination at their most effective. The tunnels allowed outnumbered defenders to contest every advance, to concentrate forces where needed, and to extract casualties far exceeding normal ratios. The battle demonstrated the limitations of firepower against prepared underground defenses. American naval gunfire, artillery, and air power forces that had overwhelmed Japanese defenses at previous islands couldn't destroy fortifications that existed primarily underground.